My name is Kevin Hunter, and I'm a longtime director for 34 years of the Western Vancouver Island Industrial Heritage Society. We also operate the Alberni Pacific Railway, and I'm also a longtime conductor on the Alberni Pacific's train. Riding on fate. 54 years ago, during the second week of November 1954, the west coast of Vancouver Island was lashed with violent storms. McMillan Lodell's Franklin River Division bore the brunt of these storms. Franklin River was one of the West Coast's largest railway logging operations, composed of two separate camps. Camp A on the Alberni Inlet was the original camp and was the terminus of all the railways in the operation. Inland, the Camp B logging camp was nestled in a valley and surrounded by steep mountains. The Franklin River operation was in chaos. Violent ocean winds and heavy rains battered Camp A. Camp B suffered the same fate, except the driving winds and the heavy rain funneled up the valley, pummeling the logging camp. Overflowing creeks and rivers washed out numerous culverts, cutting sections of the railway, and even threatened some of the bridges. The damage was so severe that the rail grade to the huge steam-operated Lidgerwood skidders washed out, isolating all three of them. The Franklin River operation had no choice. They had to shut down. The grade crew immediately commandeered all of Franklin River's 5 steam locomotives. Every available grade shovel was transported by rail to the serious washouts. Under deteriorating conditions, the large shovel spent days attempting to rebuild some of the destroyed rail grade. Desperate to hook up the rails, the section crew followed closely behind the shovels, laying track. On November 19, 1954, dawn broke rather ominously, and the morning light had to be coaxed out of the driving rain and drifting fog. It was cold, and the hilltops were capped in a thick blanket of snow. A large locomotive, the 1007, sat in Camp B, wisps of steam escaping from the cylinders. The 1007 was a 1929 Baldwin 282T saddle tank rod engine. At 90 tons, the 1007 was the largest and most powerful locomotive in the Franklin River, capable of pulling 40 loaded logging cars. Working almost exclusively on the main line, the 1007 normally made 2 and sometimes 3 trips from Camp B down to the log dump at Camp A. Desperate to haul a load of logs down to Camp A, the 1007 was ordered to hook up to 35 log cars at a siding. After coupling up to the log cars and attaching the air hoses, the 1007 sat idle, building air pressure. Pelted by heavy rains, the locomotive waited for a speeder that was transporting men from Camp A up to Camp B. Soon the speeder arrived in Camp B, coasting to a stop beside the 1007. They assured the locomotive crew the main line was clear, all the way down to Camp A. Don Moore, the regular engineer on the 1007, was laid off. Don was a relative newcomer to the division and had little seniority. He had recently hired on from the abandoned Alberni Pacific Railway operations. Bob Walker, a senior mainline engineer, took over the controls of Don's 1007 locomotive. Inside the cab of the 1007, Bob and his fireman, Stan Melichowski, were busy making last-minute adjustments. It was warm and dry in the cab, but both Bob and Stan knew they had to complete one unpleasant task before they could finally leave. Donning hats and coats, they jumped out of the cab into the driving rain. They quickly greased, oiled, and inspected the running gear of the locomotive. On that miserable morning, fate took a triple twist. Seniority again surfaced, sealing the destiny of an unsuspecting crew. The 1007 worked almost exclusively on the main line and was normally operated by one of the experienced senior locomotive engineers. The 1007's main task was to haul the loaded log cars from Camp B down to the log dump at Camp A and dump the logs in the Alberni Inlet. Being promoted to a mainline locomotive engineer was the ultimate engineer's job and the culmination of many years of experience. Another locomotive, Ed Crosby, noticed Bob and Stan working on the number 1007. Ed had worked for years on the smaller Shea locomotives, hauling cars from the woods down to the main line. Ed was the camp's senior locomotive engineer, but had never worked on the main line. Flexing his seniority muscles, he demanded to run the 1007. With grave misgivings, Ed was granted his request and within minutes was in the cab of the locomotive. Before leaving Camp B, Einar Eriksson, the head brakeman, and Alex Bregan, the second brakeman, walked to the back of the train and checked all of the loaded log cars. A mandatory brake test was performed on the train before it moved. After some last-minute instructions, Einar walked to the front of the train and climbed into the locomotive cab. Alex quickly scrambled into the caboose at the back of the train. Glad to get out of the rain, Alex stoked the fire in the stove and settled down to what he thought would be an interesting but uneventful ride. A mandatory call was made to dispatch, informing him they were on their way. The dispatcher reminded them that even though all the bridges had just been inspected, they should proceed with caution. Ed Crosby received the all clear from the head brakeman and checked to see if his fireman was ready. In a cloud of steam and a toot on the whistle, Ed released the air on the brakes and reached for the throttle. Slowly the heavy train eased down the main line, 3 million pounds of logs, steam, and steel, headed for tragedy. Settling into the rocking motion of the locomotive, Ed carefully opened up the throttle. Constantly wiping the cab windows, all three men in the cab anxiously scrutinized the rail grade in front of them. With 14 miles to travel, their biggest concern was crossing all 16 bridges. It was going to be a slow journey, especially in the miserable weather. The crew marveled at the hillsides, turned white with saturated water. Torrents of water boiled and cascaded down the swollen creeks on their short journey to the ocean. Not far out of Camp B, the rail grade increased to a steep 1.5% downgrade. Ed was busy in the cab, constantly adjusting the throttle and applying the brakes. In the left seat, the fireman skillfully maintained the boiler pressure. The head brakeman acted as another set of valuable eyes in the cab. Not only was he looking forward, he occasionally glanced back at the loaded log cars trailing behind the locomotive. Rounding a corner, the crew finally noticed the Alberni Inlet in the distance, hundreds of feet below them. Gently descending towards Camp A, the locomotive was running well. Soon they were less than a mile out of Camp A, with only one more bridge to cross. The long curved bridge over Franklin River appeared intact. Or did it? Normally mounted 20 feet above the river, there was only 4 feet of clearance underneath the bridge. Earlier, the raging torrent passing beneath the bridge had undermined a supporting bent. The bent tore away from the bridge and smashed into 2 more bents, ripping them out. The bridge was intact, but severely weakened. Unaware, the crew didn't have a chance. The 1007 locomotive steamed onto the bridge. Traveling only 60 feet on the bridge, the eerie wail of separating bridge timbers was the first dramatic indication something was terribly wrong. Seconds later, the wooden structure collapsed. The heavy locomotive sagged backwards, plunging into the tormented river. Behind the locomotive, the first log car was violently torn away from the rest of the train, its ruptured airline wildly thrashing against the log car. Franklin River swallowed both the locomotive and the log car. In a pile of twisted timbers and hissing steam, the 1007 rolled over on its side and settled on the bottom of the river. The doomed locomotive was now a steel coffin. In the time it took to extinguish the flame in the locomotive's firebox, 2 men's lives were also extinguished. The fate of Ed Crosby, the engineer on his first mainline trip, and Einar Eriksson, head brakeman, was sealed in the submerged cab. Stan Malachowski, the fireman, narrowly escaped. Surfacing 1/4 mile downstream, Stan was paralyzed with fear. He didn't know how to swim. Miraculously, he was swept close to shore. Grabbing at some overhanging branches, he dragged himself to shore. Exhausted and traumatized, Ed collapsed on the bank of the Franklin River. Unaware of the catastrophe at the bridge, Alex patiently sat in the caboose. Eventually, curiosity forced Alex out of the warm caboose into the cold, driving rain. He slowly walked towards the front of the train. Rounding the last corner before the Franklin River Bridge, Alex's pace quickened. Terror began to well up inside him. Nearing the bridge, Alex noticed a commotion on the other side of the bridge. A small group of people had gathered on the other side, pointing back at him. Then Alex noticed, with mounting alarm, the gaping hole in the Franklin River Bridge. Where was the locomotive? Within seconds, Alex was overwhelmed, finally comprehending the inevitable plight of the locomotive and the tragic fate of his friends. It was weeks before the river subsided. The skyline was rigged and the 1007 was dragged out of the river. It sustained surprisingly little damage and was repaired, living to steam for almost another 20 years. In 2001, the Alberni Pacific Railway ran the number 7 steam locomotive from the restored train station in Port Alberni out to the McLean Mill National Historic Site. Currently, we are now restoring the locomotive's boiler. There's some problems with the boiler. The boiler makers are working on it, and soon we will be steaming. The tentative plan is in 2021 to run the number 7 locomotive from Port Alberni out to the McLean Mill National Historic Site. For further information, please contact the Western Vancouver Island Industrial Heritage Society's webpage and Facebook.